The silence in my house has a weight to it now, a thickness that presses against my chest every morning when I wake up reaching for a hand that isn't there. 1 month. That's how long Thaddeus has been gone, buried in a closed casket after the accident overseas left nothing whole enough for me to see one last time. And still, I catch myself setting out 2 coffee cups before I remember. My name is Ozella Farron Bramwell, and until 5 weeks ago, I was a wife of 31 years. Now I don't know what I am. My brother Silas called on a Tuesday morning while I was still in my robe, staring at a casserole dish someone from church dropped off that I hadn't touched. His voice had an edge to it I didn't recognize, something clipped and urgent underneath the casual greeting. "Pack a bag," he said. "We're going on a cruise." I told him I wasn't in any state of mind for a vacation, that the thought of laughing on a boat deck while my husband's grave hadn't even settled felt obscene to me. He didn't back down the way he usually does when I push back on something. "This isn't a suggestion, Ozella. I already booked it. We leave Friday." Something in his tone made the hair on my arms rise. Silas has never been a pushy man. He's the brother who asks twice and lets it go if I say no. This was different. This was a man who had already made up his mind before he even dialed my number. If you're watching this and you've ever had someone in your family push you towards something without explaining why, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because I have a feeling you're about to understand exactly what I mean. I asked him why the urgency, why now? Why a cruise of all things when I could barely manage getting dressed most days? He went quiet for a second too long before answering, and when he did, his voice had softened in a way that scared me more than the firmness had. "Just trust me on this one, please." Silas has never said please to me like that in our whole lives, not once. We grew up sharing a room in our grandmother's house in Macon, and even then, he was the one who never asked for anything, who carried his weight and mine too when our mother couldn't. For him to beg me for something as small as a boat trip told me this wasn't about grief counseling or getting me out of the house. This was about something he wasn't ready to say out loud. I asked to see the itinerary before I gave him an answer, and when he sent it to my phone, one line caught my eye and wouldn't let go. A stop in Miami, 3 days in. I asked him why Miami, of all the ports a cruise could call on, and he said it was just where the ship was routed, nothing more. But I know my brother's voice when he's telling the truth, and I know it when he's building a wall around something. I said yes, not because I believed his explanation, but because some part of me, some old instinct that had kept me alive through 31 years of marriage, told me I needed to be on that boat. We sat together that evening going over details, and his phone buzzed twice against the table between us. He glanced down, and I watched his thumb move fast, silencing it before I could see who it was from. He smiled at me like nothing had happened, but I saw his hand shake first. The ship rose out of the water like something out of a dream I didn't ask to have. All white steel and glass catching the Georgia sun as we stood in the boarding line with our bags. Silas kept checking his watch even though we had hours to spare. I noticed the way his eyes moved across the crowd of families and couples around us, scanning instead of resting. "You're going to love this deck," he said, pointing at a brochure he'd clearly memorized. "They've got a whole seafood spread every evening." I let him talk. I let him fill the silence with details about excursions and dinner seatings, because I could see he needed something to hold on to, some script to follow that kept his hands busy and his mouth moving. But underneath the small talk, there was a current running through him I hadn't felt since we were children, and he'd done something he knew our grandmother would find out about. Once we settled into our cabin, I sat on the edge of the bed and watched him unpack with a precision that didn't match a man going on vacation. Everything folded, everything squared at the corners. Thaddeus used to fold his shirts like that. I pushed the thought down before it could climb any higher in my throat. Silas. I said his name the way our mother used to when she wanted the truth and not the version he thought she could handle. Why Miami? His hands paused over a stack of shirts for half a second, so brief I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching for exactly this. I told you, that's just the route. You picked this cruise. You told the travel agent where to route it, didn't you? He turned around and gave me a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Ozella, you're grieving. Your mind is looking for patterns that aren't there. Sometimes a port stop is just a port stop. I wanted to believe him. God knows I wanted to let this be nothing, to let myself enjoy 3 days of not thinking about the empty side of my bed. But 31 years of marriage teaches a woman to read a man's face for what he isn't saying. And Silas wasn't just avoiding my question. He was protecting me from something, the same way you'd shield a child from a stove you already know is hot. You've never planned a trip like this in your life, I said. You hate the water. You get seasick on a pontoon boat at the lake. Things change, he said, and busied himself with the closet door. I let it go, not because I believed him, but because I could see pushing further would only make him retreat somewhere I couldn't reach. We ate dinner that night at a small table near the window, and he was almost himself again, laughing at the waiter's jokes, asking me about a book I'd started and abandoned months ago. For a moment, I let myself forget the folder of unspoken things sitting between us. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen, and whatever color had returned to his face during dinner drained out of it in an instant. He stood so fast, his napkin slid off his lap onto the floor. I need to take this, he said, already walking away from the table, already lowering his voice before he'd even cleared the next row of diners. Give me 5 minutes. I watched him disappear around the corner toward the outer deck, phone pressed hard against his ear, his shoulders hunched in a way that told me whatever this call was. He didn't want a single word of it reaching me. The ship docked in Miami just after 10 in the morning. Sunlight bouncing off the water so bright I had to shield my eyes as we walked down the gangway. Silas had a folded paper in his pocket he kept touching, like a man checking for his wallet every few minutes out of habit. There's something happening at the marina, he said, steering us left instead of toward the shops most passengers were heading to. Some kind of business gathering. Thought we could walk through, get a feel for the area before we come back for lunch. I didn't question it. Grief has a way of making you pliable, willing to be led anywhere as long as someone else is doing the deciding. I'd spent a month being told where to sit, what to eat, when to sleep, and some tired part of me had simply stopped asking why. The marina was dressed up for something official, string lights crossing between palm trees even in daylight, a banner near the entrance announcing a shipping and logistics networking event. The kind of thing men in linen blazers attend to shake hands and trade business cards over shrimp cocktail. Silas walked slower than his usual pace, his eyes moving over the crowd in a way that had nothing to do with sightseeing. You're doing it again? I said. Doing what? Looking for someone. He laughed it off too quickly. I'm looking at the boats, Ozella. Man can admire a yacht. We drifted through the edges of the gathering, close enough to hear laughter and the clink of glasses, but far enough to still feel like outsiders. I watched couples in linen and silk make their rounds, watched a woman throw her head back laughing at something a silver-haired man said. And for a moment I let myself pretend I was just a tourist taking in a pretty afternoon. Then I saw him. A man standing near the edge of the dock, shoulders angled the way Thaddeus always stood when he was working a room he didn't fully trust, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass he wasn't drinking from. Same height, same silver at the temples, cut the exact way Thaddeus kept his. My chest tightened before my mind could even form the thought properly. Silas, I said, my voice smaller than I meant it to be. That man, over there. He didn't answer right away, and when I turned to look at him, his jaw was set in a way I'd never seen on my brother before. Like a man bracing for impact he'd known was coming for miles. I told myself it was nothing. Grief plays tricks like this. I'd read about it somewhere. How the mind conjures the faces you miss most in strangers on the street, in the back of a church pew, in a crowd at an airport. I'd done it before, weeks ago, chasing a man's cologne through a grocery store before catching myself. This was the same thing. It had to be. I took a breath and made myself look away, made myself reach for my brother's arm, and suggest we head back toward the ship before the heat got worse. That's when the man turned. Not fully. Just enough to catch the light on the side of his face, enough for every feature to settle into place with a certainty no grief-addled mind could invent. It was Thaddeus. My body moved before my mind caught up, feet already carrying me forward across the dock toward a dead man standing in the sun like he had every right to be breathing. The world narrowed to just him, the sound of the marina crowd dropping away into a dull ring in my ears. Oh, Zella. Silas's hand closed around my arm before I'd taken 3 steps, gripping hard enough to stop me cold. Don't! That's Thaddeus. My own voice sounded foreign to me, thin and cracking down the middle. Silas, that is my husband, standing right there. I know. 2 words. He said them so plainly, so without shock, that it took a moment for their weight to land on me the way they should have. I turned to look at my brother's face, searching for the confusion that should have matched mine, the horror, the disbelief. Instead, I found a man who had already made peace with what I was only just beginning to understand. You know, I repeated it back to him like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. What do you mean, you know? He pulled me back a few steps, away from the edge of the crowd, his eyes darting toward Thaddeus and back to me like he was measuring how much time we had before something worse arrived. I found out a few weeks ago. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you without breaking you. The betrayal of it hit me almost as hard as the sight of Thaddeus himself, my own brother, sitting across from me at Sunday dinners, holding my hand at the funeral, letting me collapse into grief over a man he already knew was alive somewhere, laughing in the Florida sun. You buried him with me, I said, and my voice broke clean in half. You stood there and let me put dirt on an empty casket. I was trying to be sure before I said anything. I didn't want to hand you a rumor and watch it destroy you if I was wrong. His jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw real pain cross his face, the guilt of a man who'd carried something too heavy to share. I needed you to see it yourself, so you'd never doubt it, so nobody could ever tell you that you imagined this. I wanted to scream at him right there on the dock, wanted to shake him until the last 5 weeks of my grief made sense again. Instead, a cold, creeping dread slid down my spine because something in the way he said it, so careful, so measured, told me there was more waiting on the other side of this moment. There's more, I said. It wasn't a question. Silas looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him decide something behind his eyes. Some door he'd been holding shut, finally swinging open. Wait, he said quietly. You haven't seen the worst part yet. Before I could ask him what that meant, before I could even brace myself the way his words demanded, my eyes drifted back toward Thaddeus on their own, pulled by some instinct I couldn't control. That's when I saw her. A woman stepped up beside him, slipping her arm through his with the easy familiarity of someone who had done it 1,000 times before, someone who belonged there, who had no reason to hide. She turned her face toward him, laughing at something he'd said. It was Junia, my daughter. Junia's laugh carried across the dock, light and easy, a sound I hadn't heard directed at anyone but me in years. My daughter, my only child, standing in the Florida sun with her arm through a dead man's elbow like it was the most natural place in the world for her to be. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Every part of me that had learned to walk and breathe and function over 58 years of living simply stopped, waiting for my brain to explain what my eyes were showing me. Ozella. Silas's voice reached me from somewhere far away. We need to go. I didn't answer him. I couldn't tear my eyes off my daughter's face, searching it for some sign of confusion, some indication that she too had just discovered this man was alive, that she was as much a victim of this as I was. But there was no confusion there, only comfort, only the ease of familiarity. A woman in a plain black dress approached them then, a maid or a hired hand of some kind, cradling a small bundle wrapped in soft blue against her chest. She said something I couldn't hear over the distance between us, and Junia turned with an expression I recognized instantly, the exact look I used to give my own baby 30 years ago, tired and tender all at once. My mind tried to reject what it was seeing before my heart could catch up to the truth of it. A baby. Someone had brought a baby into this gathering, and for one desperate second, I told myself it belonged to someone else entirely. Some other couple at this party, nothing to do with the two people standing in front of me. Then Thaddeus reached out his arms. The maid placed the infant into his hands with the kind of practiced trust that told me this wasn't the first time, that this was routine, that this man had done this before. He drew the baby close against his chest, and I watched him press his lips to its small forehead, the exact way he used to do with Junia when she was small enough to fit in one arm, the exact way he'd done with no one since our own daughter had grown. My knees buckled slightly, and I gripped Silas's arm to keep from going down right there on the dock. The small crowd around them shifted into something warmer, applause light and scattered, a few women stepping close to coo over the baby, a man clapping Thaddeus on the shoulder with the kind of pride reserved for a proud father. Someone said something that made the whole group laugh, and Junia leaned her head against Thaddeus's shoulder, the baby cradled between them like the center of a family portrait I had never been invited to sit for. I understood then, in the space of a single unbearable breath, exactly what I was looking at. Not an affair. Not a betrayal I could have imagined even in my worst nights of grief. A whole life, a whole family, built in secret, celebrated in the open sun while I had worn black at his funeral and let strangers hug me and tell me he was in a better place. Something inside my chest gave way entirely. A collapse so total I couldn't have named it as pain or rage or grief, because it was all of them at once, crashing through me in a single wave. Ozella, now! Silas's grip tightened around my arm, firm and urgent, pulling me backward, away from the crowd before anyone could turn and see the widow standing at the edge of their celebration. Before she sees us, move. The cabin felt smaller than it had that morning, the walls pressing in around me as I sat on the edge of the bed, still in yesterday's clothes because I hadn't found the strength to change out of them. Silas stood by the window, his back to me, hands braced against the frame like he needed something solid to hold on to before he could turn around and face what he owed me. Talk, I said. My voice had gone flat, scraped clean of everything but the demand itself. All of it. Now. He turned slowly. I saw him 3 weeks ago. I was in Miami for that contractors conference, the one I go to every year. I walked past a restaurant patio, and there he was, laughing at some table like a man without a single worry in this world. 3 weeks! The number landed like a stone in my stomach. You've known for 3 weeks, Silas. I told myself it wasn't him at first. Grief makes fools of all of us. You taught me that yourself watching you these past months. So I didn't say anything. I hired a man, Reginald Voss. to find out for certain before I put that kind of weight on you. You let me bury him. My hands had started shaking, and I pressed them flat against my knees to still them. You let me stand at that grave and grieve a man you already suspected was breathing somewhere in Florida. I needed proof, Ozella. Real proof, not a resemblance on a restaurant patio. If I'd come to you with a hunch and I was wrong, I'd have torn open a wound that was already killing you for nothing. And if I was right, I needed you to never doubt it, never wonder if I'd imagined it or exaggerated it. I needed you to see it with your own eyes, so nobody, not a lawyer, not a judge, not your own mind on a hard night, could ever tell you that you made this up. The word lawyer sat strange in my ear, a small thread I filed away without fully understanding why he'd chosen it. So you built this whole trip around finding him. Voss did the work. He traced the company. This shipping business registered under a name I'd never heard, Desmond Wynn. Found out Thaddeus, or whoever he's calling himself now, had a mixer planned with other logistics companies at that marina, open enough that anybody could walk through if they knew when to show up. I booked the cruise the moment Voss confirmed the date. So none of it was chance? No. He said it plainly, no flinching. None of it. I stared at my brother, this man who had held my hand through a funeral he knew was a lie, who had let me sob into his shoulder over a grave that held nothing but an empty box, and something in me wanted to scream at him and thank him in the same breath. The fury sat right alongside the grief now, twin flames burning through whatever numbness had carried me through the last month. He knelt in front of me, taking both my hands in his. I couldn't watch you fall apart without knowing the truth first. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry I let you bury an empty casket. I sat there, letting the anger and the grief braid themselves into something new, something colder and more solid than either one alone. My husband was alive. My daughter had built a family with him in secret, and my brother had known for weeks, quietly building a case instead of a comfort. I looked up at Silas, and the question came out of me low and steady, stripped of every ounce of the sorrow that had carried me for 5 weeks straight. What do I do now? Atlanta welcomed me home with the same quiet I'd left behind, except now the quiet had teeth. I moved through the house for weeks doing little more than existing, letting the days blur into each other without names, without shape. The woman who had stood on that dock in Miami seemed like someone else entirely, someone I'd watched from a distance rather than been. Eulalie came by most afternoons, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her 20 years ago, setting down whatever dish she'd cooked without asking if I'd eaten the last one. She'd sit with me in the kitchen, filling the silence with church gossip and news about her grandchildren, watching me over the rim of her coffee cup with an attention I recognized even through my fog. "You're not grieving the same way," she said one afternoon. No preamble, just laid the words on the table between us like she'd been carrying them a while. "I buried my Charles, Ozella. I know what that looks like on a woman's face. This is something else sitting on you." I opened my mouth, and for one dangerous second, the whole truth sat right at the edge of my tongue. The cruise, the marina. Thaddeus's face turning in the sunlight, the baby in his arms. I wanted so badly to hand the weight of it to someone else, anyone else, to not be the only person carrying the full shape of what I'd seen. "I'm just tired, Eulalie." The lie tasted bitter going down. Tired down to my bones. She didn't push, though I could see in her eyes she didn't believe me either. She squeezed my hand before she left that evening, told me to call her at any hour, day or night. And I sat alone afterward wondering how much longer I could carry this by myself. That night, I couldn't sleep, and I found myself standing in the doorway of Thaddeus's old office, a room I'd avoided since the funeral, because everything in it still smelled faintly of him. I told myself I was looking for a photograph, something small and harmless, but my hands moved with purpose once I sat down at his desk. Opening drawers I had no real reason to open. Most of it was ordinary. Old invoices, expired warranties, a stack of business cards rubber-banded together. But tucked beneath a folder of tax documents, I found a distribution schedule from the trust his attorney had drawn up years ago, the paper crisp, barely handled. I scanned the page out of habit more than suspicion, until a date near the bottom stopped my eyes cold. The authorization for my distribution, the paperwork releasing the funds into my name, was dated 11 days before his death certificate had even been filed. I read it twice, certain I'd misunderstood something, some formality of trust law I didn't know enough to interpret correctly. But the date sat there plainly, unmoving, refusing to rearrange itself into anything that made sense. A man doesn't authorize a distribution from beyond the grave. Someone sets that in motion while they're still very much alive, still sitting at a desk somewhere, signing his name to paper with a steady hand. I sat there in his old chair, the house silent around me, staring at a date that didn't add up in a story I'd already begun to suspect was built entirely out of lies. The trust document sat on my kitchen table for 3 days, and I couldn't make myself put it away in a drawer where I wouldn't have to look at it. Every time I passed through that room, my eyes found that date again. That impossible date that placed a signature on paper while the man who supposedly made it was already 6 feet under Georgia soil. I called Silas and asked him for the investigator's number without any preamble, and he gave it to me without asking a single question, like he'd been waiting for this call since the day we got back from Miami. Reginald Voss met me at a diner off the highway. A quiet man with tired eyes and a notepad he barely used. The kind of man who'd clearly heard worse confessions than mine across that same table. I laid out what I'd found, the date on the distribution, and he listened without interrupting, nodding slowly like a doctor confirming a diagnosis he'd already suspected. "I need to tell you something before you hire me properly," he said. "Whatever's underneath this, once we start pulling the thread, it doesn't stop where you want it to. I've seen women think they wanted the truth and then beg me to stop halfway through finding it. I already saw him standing on a dock in Miami with a baby in his arms," I said. "I don't think there's a version of this that gets worse than what I've already lived." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once and opened his notepad for real this time. "Give me a week." The week felt longer than the 5 that had come before it. Longer than the entire month of wailing I'd already survived. When Voss called, his voice had none of the caution from the diner, only the flat certainty of a man laying facts on a table. "There's a limited liability company registered in Florida," he said, "filed under the name Desmond Wynn. Shipping and logistics, same industry Thaddeus was always in. Public record. Easy enough to pull once you know the name to search." "When was it filed?" "That's the part you need to sit down for, Mrs. Bramwell." A pause, and I could hear paper shuffling on his end of the line. 14 months before his death certificate was ever issued. The floor of my understanding shifted entirely beneath me. I had assumed, in whatever fractured logic grief allows a person, that this was a recent unraveling, a man who'd panicked and run within the last few months, maybe even the same season he'd died. 14 months meant Thaddeus had been building an entire second life, while still sitting across from me at our own dinner table, while still kissing me goodnight, while still standing beside me at our niece's wedding, and dancing the first song like a man with nowhere else he'd rather be. "He was living 2 lives for over a year," I said, and the words tasted like ash going out. "Longer than that, most likely. Businesses like this don't spring up overnight. There's groundwork before the filing, bank accounts, licenses. My guess is he started planning this closer to 2 years back." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, unable to speak, feeling something in my chest go cold, and still in a way that felt almost like relief, like the last soft place in me had finally hardened into something usable. "There's one more thing," Voss said, his voice dropping lower. "I pulled everything I could find on the death report itself, the paperwork from the Dominican Republic. Mrs. Bramwell, I've seen thin documentation before, but this one barely holds together at all." Augustin Pryor's office smelled like old leather and printer ink, the same smell it had carried the day I sat there signing papers as a grieving widow, believing every word of what I'd been told. This time, I sat across from him with a different posture entirely, spine straight, hands folded, a woman who no longer needed comforting. "I need to understand something," I said, before he'd even finished sitting down. "If it turns out Thaddeus is alive, and the death was staged, what happens to what he left me?" Pryor's expression didn't shift the way I expected. He didn't gasp or ask me to repeat myself. He simply leaned back slightly, folding his hands on the desk, a man choosing his next words with care. "Are you telling me you have reason to believe that's the case, Mrs. Bramwell?" "I'm telling you I need to know before I say anything else." He studied me a long moment, then nodded slowly, understanding without me having to spell it out further. "Let's speak hypothetically then. In cases like this, if a person were to fake their own death to trigger a trust distribution, and later that fraud came to light, that person would typically be barred from reclaiming what was distributed. He can't undo his own crime to benefit from it twice. Courts generally don't allow a man to profit from a fraud, and then profit again by unwinding it once it's inconvenient for him. And me? What happens to what I've already received? If you had no knowledge of the deception, if you received those funds in good faith, believing your husband had genuinely died, your claim to that distribution would very likely stand. Courts tend to treat someone in your position as an innocent beneficiary. It would come down to the specifics, but that's the general shape of it, and the law leans heavily in that direction. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something unclench in my chest that had been wound tight since the moment I read that date on the distribution schedule. So, there's nothing he can do. Legally. Not easily, and not without confessing to a felony first. Even then, the money would be very unlikely to be clawed back from you specifically. Pryor's eyes held mine steadily. "I won't promise you certainties, Mrs. Bramwell. No honest attorney would. But whatever is happening here, the law is leaning strongly in your favor." I felt the strangest thing then, sitting in that office with the truth settling over me like a coat I hadn't realized I needed. Some small, tired part of me wondered if keeping that money made me no better than what he'd tried to do, paying me off instead of facing me honestly. But I pushed that thought down hard and let something colder and more certain take its place. He hadn't given me that money out of love. He'd given it to buy his own silence, to grease the wheels of his disappearing act, to make himself feel less like a coward while he built a new life with my daughter on his arm. I decided, right there in that leather chair, that I would keep every single cent of it. Not because I needed it, though I did. Because it was mine. Earned through 31 years, I'd given a man who owed me far more than money could ever cover. "There's something else," Pryor said, shifting a folder on his desk, his tone changing just slightly. "Cornelius Draper has called this office 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Says he needs to speak with someone about the business, about irregularities he's found. I didn't return his calls, given the circumstances, but he sounded rattled, Mrs. Bramwell. Genuinely rattled. Cornelius Draper called my cell phone directly the morning after my meeting with Pryor, his voice carrying the particular strain of a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. He introduced himself as Thaddeus's business partner. offered his condolences again like a man who genuinely meant it, and asked if we could speak about some matters concerning the company. I agreed to meet him, curious what a man who believed himself to be dealing with a grieving widow might reveal without knowing the ground beneath him had already shifted. We met at a small cafe near the business district, and the moment he sat down across from me, I understood Voss's assessment had been right. Cornelius Draper looked like a man carrying real grief, the kind that hadn't been performed for anyone's benefit. His eyes were tired, his hands restless around his coffee cup. "I've been running things since he passed," he said, trying to keep it steady for the employees, for his memory. "But I've found some things in the accounts that don't sit right with me, Mrs. Bramwell, and I didn't know who else to bring them to." "What kind of things?" "There's an offshore account tied to the shipping side of the business, Cayman-based. I only found it because a wire transfer bounced back and I had to trace where it was meant to go. Thaddeus never mentioned it to me, not once in 12 years of partnership, and I built half this company standing shoulder to shoulder with that man." I sat very still, watching him turn his cup slowly on the table, a man genuinely trying to make sense of a betrayal he didn't yet know was so much larger than a hidden bank account. "I don't understand how I missed this," he said, more to himself than to me. I trusted him completely. Something in me softened toward him despite everything. Some recognition of a fellow person being lied to by the same man, made a fool of in his own way. I weighed how much to say, how much this innocent man deserved to know before the whole truth came crashing down on all of us at once. I decided, sitting there, that it wasn't my place yet to hand him that weight. Not until I had everything I needed to make it undeniable. "Keep documenting what you find," I told him. "Everything, dates, numbers, all of it." He nodded, grateful for direction, unaware he was building evidence for something far beyond a business dispute. My phone rang the moment I got back to my car, Voss's name lighting up the screen. "I found something in Florida Public Records," he said, skipping any greeting. "A marriage license, filed 8 months ago." My chest tightened. "Whose?" "Desmond Wynne and Junia Prescott." A pause, letting the words land fully. "Mrs. Bramwell, your husband is legally married to your daughter under his new identity. And since your marriage to him was only ever ended by a fraudulent death, not a divorce, that marriage is void the moment this comes to light. He's committed bigamy on top of everything else." I gripped the steering wheel, the world tilting again the way it had on that dock in Miami. "There's one more thing," Voss added, his voice dropping lower, more careful now. "I finally got a contact to pull what exists of the death report from the Dominican Republic. Mrs. Bramwell, I've reviewed hundreds of these documents in my career. This one is missing signatures, missing verification stamps, missing half of what should exist for a death to be certified abroad. Whoever filed this either didn't know what they were doing or didn't care, because they never expected anyone to look this closely. I found Junia's number still saved under an old contact photo from her college graduation, a version of her I barely recognized anymore. I texted her a single line, asking her to meet me, mother to daughter, no explanations attached. She agreed faster than I expected, suggesting a hotel lounge in Atlanta where she said she'd be for a work trip, and I understood then that some part of her had been waiting for this call as much as dreading it. She looked older than the woman I'd seen on that dock, tired in a way makeup couldn't quite smooth over. She sat down across from me, hands folded tightly in her lap, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. "You look well," I said finally, keeping my voice even, giving away nothing. "Mama." Her voice cracked on the single word. "I don't know what you want me to say." "I'm not here for an apology." I let that sit between us, watched her flinch slightly at the flatness of it. I want the truth. All of it. Starting with when. When what? When did you know he was alive, Junia? Before I buried him or after? Her eyes dropped to the table, and I watched her hands twist together, watched the performance of confusion drain out of her face entirely, replaced by something raw. Before, she said, so quietly I almost missed it. I knew before. The confirmation landed differently than I expected, quieter than the fury I'd carried into that lounge, settling instead into something like ice moving through my veins. You sat in that church. You watched me put dirt on his casket. You knew the whole time it was empty. I couldn't tell you. He made me promise, said it would ruin everything, said you'd never understand, that you'd go to the police before he could. She stopped herself, pressing her lips together like she'd said more than she meant to. Before he could what? She didn't answer that. Instead, her eyes filled, and for the first time since I'd sat down, I saw something that looked less like guilt and more like fear crack through her composure. You don't know him the way I know him now, Mama. Not really. Not the man he's become. I know he faked his own death and let his wife bury an empty box. I know he's been building a whole life with my own daughter on his arm while I wore black, for a grave with nothing in it. I love him. She said it like a confession she couldn't take back once it left her mouth. I do. But it's not simple, what this is. It's not what it looks like from the outside. Then tell me what it is. She glanced around the lounge, an instinct I recognized as pure survival, checking who might be listening before she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. He doesn't let go of things easily, Mama. People who try to leave him, people who threaten what he's built. Her hand trembled slightly around her water glass. I need you to be careful. More careful than you think you need to be. I sat back slowly, studying my daughter's face, searching for the manipulation I expected to find there, and finding instead something that looked unmistakably like real fear. Junia, I said slowly. Are you afraid of him? She didn't answer. She just looked at me, and in her silence, I heard everything she couldn't bring herself to say out loud. Pryor's conference room had become a second home to me by then. Folders spread across the table in neat, deliberate stacks, the way I once organized recipe cards for Sunday dinners. Voss sat at one end reviewing pages he'd already reviewed a dozen times, and I found something steadying in the repetition, in the sheer discipline of building something too solid to collapse under Thaddeus's weight. Let's walk through it once more, Pryor said, so nothing's missing when the time comes. Voss slid the first folder forward. The death report from the Dominican Republic. Missing signatures, no verification stamps, filed through a small local office known for lax oversight, thin enough that any competent fraud examiner would flag it in an afternoon. Next came the papers on Desmond Wynn, the forged documents Thaddeus had used to build his entire second identity, a birth certificate that didn't exist in any real hospital's records, a social security number that traced back to a man who died decades ago in another state entirely. Voss had confirmed it himself through the Social Security Administration's own public death index, a database anyone can search once they have a number to check, and it had flagged the number as belonging to a man deceased since 1987. Not a legal name change filed with any court, manufactured from nothing, bought the way a man buys silence. Identity fraud, plain and clean, Pryor said. That alone carries real weight. Then the marriage license, Desmond Wynn and Junia Prescott, filed in Florida 8 months prior, void from its very first signature since Thaddeus's marriage to me had never legally ended. Bigamy, Pryor said simply, the word landing heavier each time I heard it spoken aloud. And finally, Junia's own words from that hotel lounge, which I'd written down that same night while they were still fresh, dated and detailed enough that Pryor said it could stand as a statement if it ever needed to. "This is airtight, Mrs. Bramwell," Pryor said, closing the final folder. "Whenever you're ready to move, the ground is solid beneath you." I drove home that evening, wearing the same composed face I'd worn to church the week before, to the grocery store, to Eulalie's dinner table, a mask I'd perfected over months of carrying this alone. But Eulalie has known me 30 years, and masks don't hold long against a woman who's watched every version of your face since we were young mothers together. Ozella. She set her fork down at dinner that night, studying me with the same directness she'd used weeks earlier. "I'm done pretending I don't see it. Something is eating you alive, and I won't sit here and watch you carry it by yourself another day." The dam broke before I'd decided to let it. I told her everything: the cruise, the dock, the baby, Junia's marriage, the forged papers, all of it spilling out in a rush I couldn't have stopped if I'd wanted to. Eulalie sat perfectly still through the whole account, her hand finding mine partway through and never letting go. When I finished, she pulled me into her arms right there at the kitchen table, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight since that dock in Miami. For the first time in months, I wasn't the only person holding the full weight of this. My phone buzzed against the table as she held me. A text from Voss, short and urgent. "Someone in Miami is asking questions." Words getting back to Wynn that a PI has been digging. He may already know we're close. The call came on a Thursday evening, an unlisted number lighting up my screen while I sat folding laundry in the same quiet house I'd learned to survive in alone. Something told me before I even answered, some instinct that had sharpened considerably over the past months, exactly who was on the other end. Ozella. His voice hadn't changed at all, still smooth, still carrying that same practiced warmth he'd used on me for 31 years. Hearing it directed at me again, after everything, sent a cold current through my chest that I didn't let touch my face or my tone. "Thaddeus." I said his real name deliberately, not the one he'd been hiding behind. "Or should I call you Desmond?" Silence stretched on his end, just long enough to tell me the name had landed exactly the way I intended. "So you know." "I've known for a while now." "Ozella, listen to me." His voice shifted into something more urgent, the tone I remembered from arguments over money decades ago, the one he used when he needed to steer a conversation back onto his own ground. "Whatever you think you understand, there's more to this than you realize. Let me explain it to you properly. In person. I don't need an explanation. I have the paperwork. I can make this easier for both of us." A pause, calculated, the sound of a man reaching for his oldest tool. "There's more money, Ozella. More than what the trust already gave you. Whatever this is costing you, whatever you think you're owed for my silence, name it. I'll wire it tomorrow morning if you just let this stay quiet." Something almost like laughter rose in my throat, bitter and disbelieving. "You think this is about money. I think you're hurt, and hurt people want to be made whole." "I am whole, Thaddeus. I became whole the moment I stopped waiting on you to make me that way." I let the silence sit a beat before continuing, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I have your marriage license, the one you filed under Desmond Wynn. I have the forged documents your new identity was built on, the fake birth certificate, the borrowed social security number. I have Junia's own words, given freely about exactly when she learned you were alive. My attorney has all of it." The silence that followed carried real weight this time, no performance in it at all. I could hear his breathing change, quicker, shallower, a man realizing the ground beneath him had already given way before he'd even known to brace for it. Ozella. My name came out of him differently now, stripped of its earlier smoothness, something raw and afraid underneath it. Please, think about what this does to Junia, to the baby. Think about what it does to all of us. I have thought of nothing else for months. My voice didn't waver. You didn't think of me when you built that grave with nothing in it. You didn't think of me when you let me wear black and cry into strangers' shoulders over a lie. There's still time to handle this quietly. No, I said, there isn't. Ozella, wait. The paperwork is already filed, Thaddeus. I let each word land slow and deliberate. It has been for 3 days. I ended the call before he could say another word, and I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, listening to my own steady breathing, feeling, for the first time since that dock in Miami, entirely and completely in control. The knock on my door came from a detective, not a reporter, though the reporters weren't far behind him. He introduced himself plainly, told me the Miami-Dade authorities had moved on the case that morning, and asked if I had a few minutes to answer some questions for the record. I invited him in and answered every one of them with the same steadiness I'd carried since that phone call 3 days earlier. Pryor had warned me it wouldn't happen overnight, that prosecutors would need weeks to build a case clean enough to survive a courtroom, verifying the death report, tracing the forged documents back to their source, confirming the marriage license through Florida's own records before anyone moved. 6 weeks had passed since my attorney filed everything. 6 weeks of waiting that had tested every ounce of patience I had left. Thaddeus was arrested at the office of his shipping company in front of employees who had known him only as Desmond Wynn, a name that meant nothing until a joint federal-state task force laid it beside a forged birth certificate and a decades-dead man's social security number. Voss called that afternoon with details I hadn't asked for, but needed anyway. How Thaddeus hadn't resisted. How he'd simply stood there while they read him his rights, all his careful architecture collapsing in the space of a single morning. Cornelius Draper called me that same evening, his voice hollow in a way I hadn't heard even at our cafe meeting weeks before. They're saying the offshore account was the tip of something bigger. Ozella, I had no idea. 12 years, and I had no idea who I was standing next to. I know, I told him, and I meant it. He deserved better than what Thaddeus had handed him. A business built on borrowed ground, now cracking under scrutiny with honest employees caught in the wreckage. Junia's name surfaced in the coverage within a day. A woman connected to the case through a Florida marriage license that investigators quickly flagged as void. Her own knowledge of the fraud, now a question mark, hovering over her future. I saw a clip of her leaving her Miami apartment, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, saying nothing to the small cluster of reporters trailing her down the sidewalk. She looked smaller than I remembered her on that dock, smaller than the woman who'd laughed with her head tilted back against a dead man's shoulder. The local news in Atlanta picked up the story 2 days later, a segment running under a headline about a businessman who faked his death and was found alive in Miami, married under a false identity to his own stepdaughter. I watched it once, sitting in my living room with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, and felt something strange settle over me. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of stillness I hadn't known since before the funeral. I wasn't the woman from that footage of the burial anymore, the one in black being held up by relatives on either side. I watched myself on the screen in memory only, a stranger I'd once been, and understood how far I'd traveled from her in these months. My phone buzzed late that night, long after the news vans had presumably packed up and gone. Junia's name lit up the screen. A text this time, not a call. Mama, please, I know you probably hate me. I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I have nowhere else to turn, and I'm scared of what happens to me now. Please, call me back. I read it twice, feeling everything in me go very quiet. I set the phone face down on the table and didn't answer. 9 months passed between that unanswered text and the morning I stood in a downtown courtroom watching Thaddeus enter his plea. He looked smaller than I remembered, the confidence that had carried him through 2 lives now stripped down to a gray jumpsuit and shackled hands. False statements to a foreign government, identity fraud, document forgery, bigamy. The marriage to Junia rendered void the moment the truth surfaced. He took a plea deal in the end, sparing everyone a trial, and the judge handed down a sentence that would keep him well into his 70s before he saw open sky again. Junia was never charged criminally. Prosecutors told Pryor there wasn't enough to prove she'd helped build the fraud rather than simply learned of it after the fact. And in the end, they used her as a witness against Thaddeus instead of a target. But her name would follow her the rest of her life, through every search engine that mattered. I heard she'd moved somewhere quiet, away from Miami, away from anyone who'd recognize her from the coverage. I never called her back. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay that way, not out of cruelty, but because a woman only has so much room in her heart for rebuilding, and I needed all of mine for myself. The trust money stood exactly where Pryor had promised it would, untouched by any of it, legally and completely mine. People in Atlanta looked at me differently now, not with the soft pity of a woman who'd buried her husband, but with something more careful, more respectful, the way you look at someone who survived something and came out the other side standing taller than before. Silas came by one evening in early spring, and we sat on my back porch the way we had as children on our grandmother's steps, watching the light fade slow and gold across the yard. "You did good," he said quietly. "Better than good." "It cost me a year of my life," I said. "Cost me a daughter. It cost you a version of your life that was already a lie, Ozella. You didn't lose Junia this year. You lost her the day she chose him over you, years before any of us knew it." I let that settle, watching the last of the sun disappear behind the trees. "Thank you for finding him, for not letting me bury a lie without ever knowing." "I'd do it again," he said, and I believed him completely. I used part of the trust money to open a small business scholarship fund in my name, helping women starting over in midlife the way I'd had to. Women who needed capital and no one willing to give it to them without a husband's signature backing their word. I named it after my grandmother, the woman who raised Silas and me on nothing but stubborn faith, and watched the first round of applications come in within a month of the announcement. The old shipping office, seized in the fraud proceedings and later auctioned. I bought outright, gutting the interior, repainting the walls a warm cream instead of the cold gray Thaddeus had always preferred. I kept one thing from the original furnishings, his old leather desk chair, worn soft in places from years of him sitting in judgment over everyone around him. I sat in it now, in my own office, in my own building, running something entirely mine. I turned off the desk lamp, rose from the chair that no longer belonged to a coward, and closed the office door behind me for the night, ready for whatever tomorrow asked of me next.